The invitation had been an instruction, not a request. It arrived not in an elegant cream-colored envelope sealed with wax, but as a stark, telegram-style message delivered by a private courier who looked as grim as a winter undertaker. Corvus Reed, deceased, funeral Tuesday, Saltwind Manor, attendance required. There was no, please, no, we would be honored by your presence. There was only the blunt finality of fact, as unyielding as the granite cliffs upon which the Reed family had built their dynasty. My name is Elias Vance, and at the time, I was engaged to marry Eleanor Reed. I had loved her for 3 years spent in the bustling, rational world of the city, a world away from the salt, scarred shores of her ancestral home. In all that time, she had spoken of her family with a strange mixture of affection, and what I could only describe as a deeply ingrained apprehension. She painted pictures of Saltwind Manor with words that were both beautiful and bleak, a sprawling gray stone edifice clinging to the edge of the world, perpetually shrouded in mist, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent North Sea. She spoke of her father, Corvus, the family patriarch, with a respect that bordered on fear, a man whose silence was more commanding than any shout. Now, that silence was permanent. My journey north was a descent into an older, colder world. The highways narrowed to country lanes, which in turn gave way to a single, rutted track that wound its way through gorse and hither. The air grew thick with the smell of brine and damp earth. Finally, through a curtain of persistent drizzle, I saw it. Saltwind Manor was not a house. It was a geological feature, a growth of stone that seemed to have risen from the cliff itself, weathered and gray and immense. Its slate roof glistened darkly, and a single plume of smoke rose from one of its many chimneys, a lonely signal of life in a landscape that felt preternaturally still. Eleanor met me at the door, the woman who in the city was a vibrant art historian, her laughter a bright and easy thing, was transformed. She was pale, her movements contained, her green eyes, usually so full of light, clouded and distant. She did not rush into my arms. She simply took my hand, her fingers cold as stone, and squeezed it once. "Elias," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Elle. I'm so sorry." I tried to pull her into an embrace, to offer the simple, human comfort of touch, but she stiffened, a barely perceptible resistance that was nonetheless as clear as a spoken command. "Not here," she murmured, her eyes flicking nervously towards the shadowed hallway behind her. "There are rules." The house was as imposing inside as it was out. A cavernous great hall was paneled in dark, almost black oak. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in, but it offered little warmth, its light swallowed by the oppressive shadows. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper and something else, something metallic and faint, like the tang of blood after a bitten lip. But what struck me most was the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a heavy, pressurized thing, full of unspoken words and emotions deliberately, forcefully held in check. Family members, uncles, aunts, cousins I had never met, drifted through the rooms like ghosts. They were all cast from the same mold, tall, gaunt figures with the same pale skin and dark, watchful eyes as Eleanor. They nodded at me, their faces impassive masks, their acknowledgments brief and formal. No one spoke of the deceased. No one offered condolences. No one, as far as I could see, shed a single tear. I was shown to a guest room in the west wing. It was spacious and opulent in a decaying sort of way, with a large 4-poster bed and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the meager light. As I unpacked, I felt an unease settle deep in my bones. It was more than just the natural somberness of a house in mourning. This was different. This was a performance, a ritual of emotional austerity that felt profoundly unnatural. Back home, when my own grandfather had passed, our house had been filled with the sounds of grief weeping, shared stories, laughter through tears, the comforting chaos of family coming together to share a burden. Here, the burden was being shouldered in absolute, isolating silence. That evening, a meal was served in the grand dining room. We sat at a long, polished table under the unseeing eyes of stern-faced Reed ancestors in oil portraits. The patriarch, Corvus, was now absent from the head of the table, his chair left starkly empty. His wife, Eleanor's mother Maeve, sat in his place. She was a formidable woman, with iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, making her look even more severe. She presided over the meal with a chilling stillness, her back ramrod straight, her gaze missing nothing. The meal was eaten with the same unnerving quiet. The only sounds were the scrape of silver on china and the distant moan of the wind outside. I tried to catch Eleanor's eye, to send her a look of reassurance, but her attention was fixed on her plate. I felt like an actor who had stumbled onto a stage without a script, the rules of the play a complete mystery to me. The silence was a language, and I did not understand its grammar. It was a test, and I was certain I was failing it. After the plates were cleared, I found Eleanor alone in the library, standing before a window that looked out onto the churning sea. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally broken. Rain lashed against the thick glass, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. I said softly, coming to stand beside her, "Talk to me. What is this? Why is everyone acting this way? It's not normal." She turned from the window, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the woman I knew. There was a crack in the porcelain mask, a raw vulnerability in her eyes. "It is our way, Elias. It is the Reed way. But why? Your father just died. People are supposed to be sad. They're supposed to cry, to comfort each other." Her expression hardened again, the mask sliding back into place. "We do not cry for our dead. We never have. Never? What does that even mean?" I was growing frustrated, my rational mind rebelling against this cold, unfeeling tradition. "Are you telling me you're not sad? That you don't miss him?"
Of course I miss him!
The words burst from her, sharp and pained, before she caught herself, her hand flying to her mouth as if to snatch them back. She looked around the empty library, her body tense with fear. "You don't understand. You can't. It's not about want. It's about necessity." Necessity. What could possibly make it necessary to pretend you don't have a heart? She shook her head, turning back to the window. The reflection showed her face, pale and haunted. "Sorrow is a luxury we cannot afford. Grief is our beacon." An invitation. An invitation for what? I pressed, my voice rising. "Please, Elias," she begged, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Don't ask any more questions. Just for the next 2 days, just be still. Be silent. For me, please." The plea in her eyes was so genuine, so full of a fear I couldn't comprehend, that I relented. I agreed, though every instinct screamed against it. I would play their silent game, but I would also watch. I would learn. The day of the funeral dawned gray and cold, the storm having passed, leaving behind a sky the color of washed-out slate. There was no service in the house, no priest or minister. There were no eulogies, no shared memories. After a brief, silent breakfast, the family began to assemble in the great hall. The men were all dressed in identical black suits, the women in simple, unadorned black dresses. Maeve, the matriarch, stood before the great hearth, her posture as rigid as a ship's mast. She held a small, weathered wooden box. One by one, each member of the family approached her. She would open the box and they would take something from it. A small, dried sprig of what looked like reeds, tied with black thread. They pinned this to their lapels or dresses without a word, their faces set and grim. When it was my turn, Maeve's eyes, as gray and cold as the sea, met mine. They held no warmth, only a stark warning. I took the sprig, its texture dry and brittle, and pinned it to my own suit, the simple act feeling like an initiation into a cult. The procession began. There was no hearse. 6 of Corvus's brothers and nephews, all of them built like longshoremen, carried the coffin on their shoulders. It was a plain pine box, devoid of any ornament, its raw wood a startling contrast to the decaying grandeur of the manor. We walked out of the house and followed a winding path that led away from the manicured lawns and towards the cliffs. The air was sharp with salt. The only sounds were the crunch of our feet on the gravel path, the cry of gulls circling high overhead, and the ceaseless, rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. It was a funeral dirge composed by the elements themselves. The Reed family's cemetery was a place of stark and haunting beauty. It was not nestled in a peaceful grove of trees, but perched precariously on a headland overlooking the sea. The graves were marked not with crosses, but with simple, upright slabs of granite, weathered by centuries of wind and salt spray. They faced the water, as if the dead were keeping an eternal watch. I saw the symbol Eleanor had mentioned once in passing, a motif I hadn't understood at the time, carved into each headstone a cluster of reeds, their stems bent as if by a great wind, intertwined with a stylized, curling wave. A fresh grave had been dug near the edge of the cliff. The earth beside it was dark and loamy. The 6 men lowered the coffin into the ground with practiced, silent efficiency. There were no prayers said over the open grave. No words of committal. There was only the heavy, oppressive silence of the family, their faces turned not towards the grave, but towards the vast, gray expanse of the sea. They stood like statues, their expressions unreadable, their bodies braced against the wind. I stood beside Eleanor, my hand wanting so desperately to find hers, to offer a simple squeeze of comfort, of shared humanity in the face of death's finality. But I remembered her plea, the fear in her eyes. I kept my hands clenched at my sides, my muscles aching with the effort of restraint. I watched her face, searching for any sign of the grief I knew she must be feeling. Her jaw was tight, a muscle twitching near her temple. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, but it was unfocused, as if she were looking at something far beyond it. Then, the rite began. Maeve stepped forward. She picked up a wooden shovel that was leaning against a nearby headstone. She scooped up a small amount of earth and, with a slow, deliberate movement, tossed it onto the coffin below. It landed with a soft, hollow thud that seemed to echo in the profound silence. She then handed the shovel to the next person in line, Corvus's eldest brother. He repeated the action. And so it went down the line from the oldest to the youngest. Each reed took their turn, adding a shovelful of earth to the grave, a silent, personal act of burial. The ritual was mesmerizing in its austerity. It was slow, methodical, and deeply unsettling. As the shovel was passed from hand to hand, I felt the weight of generations, of all the reeds who had stood on this cliff, performing this same silent act, burying their dead and their sorrow together. This was not a tradition born of a single generation's whim. It was ancient. Its roots sunk deep into the very rock beneath our feet. When the shovel reached Eleanor, her hand trembled slightly as she took it. She walked to the edge of the grave, her movement stiff. She dug the shovel into the pile of earth, the metal scraping against a hidden stone. For a moment, she stood frozen, her back to me, the shovel full of dirt. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face. I saw her shoulders hitch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A sob, caught and strangled in her throat before it could be born. And then I saw it. A single perfect tear escaped her eye. It traced a glistening path down her pale cheek. She did not raise a hand to wipe it away, not yet. It hung there for a second, a tiny jewel of forbidden grief, a rebellion in miniature. In the profound stillness of the ceremony, it felt as loud as a scream. Her mother Maeve saw it too. Her eyes narrowed, and a look of something I could only describe as pure, cold fury flashed across her face. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by her usual impassive mask, but I had seen it. It was not the look of a mother wanting to comfort her grieving daughter. It was the look of a guard, seeing a prisoner attempt an escape. Eleanor must have felt her mother's gaze. Her body went rigid. With a sudden, jerky movement, she tossed the earth into the grave. As she turned to pass the shovel to the next person, the back of her hand brushed against her cheek, smearing the tear away as if it were a stain, an impurity that had to be erased. The shovel was passed to me. My heart hammered in my chest. I was the outsider, the observer. Now I was being asked to participate. I took the heavy wooden handle. It felt cold and strangely intimate, warmed by the hands of all the reeds who had held it before me. I walked to the grave's edge and looked down. The pine box was now half covered with earth. It seemed so small, so final. I thought of Corvus, a man I had met only a handful of times, a man whose formidable presence was now reduced to this box in the ground. And I thought of Eleanor, of the stolen tear, of the fear that was so powerful it could suffocate the most basic of human emotions. I scooped up the dirt and let it fall. The thud was a punctuation mark in a sentence I couldn't read. As I stepped back, I met Maeve's gaze again. This time, her eyes held a flicker of something new alongside the warning, a sliver of appraisal, perhaps even approval. I had passed their silent test. The thought made me feel sick. The last shovelful of earth was thrown. The grave was filled. The family did not linger. There was no final lingering look. They simply turned as one and began the slow, silent procession back to the manor, leaving Corvus Reed alone on his wind-swept cliff unwatched, and by all outward appearances unmourned. Back at the house, the strange, silent wake continued. People stood in small, quiet groups, nursing glasses of sherry or whiskey. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that was almost electric. The rite was over, but the spell had not been broken. I found a moment to draw Eleanor aside, into the alcove of a large bay window. "Are you all right?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She nodded, but her eyes were still distant. "I'm fine. I saw. At the grave. I saw your tear." Her whole body flinched, as if I had struck her. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Never speak of it. Do you understand me, Elias? You saw nothing. But why?" I insisted, my voice still a whisper but filled with a new urgency. "What are you all so afraid of? What is this invitation you were talking about? Who are you inviting?" She looked past me, her eyes scanning the room, making sure no one was close enough to hear. She leaned in, her lips close to my ear. Her breath was cold. "You want to know?" she whispered, a terrible bleak resignation in her tone. "Fine. You're to be part of this family. You deserve to know what you're marrying into. You saw the symbol on the headstones. The reed and the wave." I nodded, my skin prickling. "The reeds are us. We bend, but we do not break. We are silent, we endure. The wave is what we keep at bay. It is old, Elias. Older than this house, older than our name. It has no name of its own, but we call it the sorrow eater, the grief taker." "What are you talking about? A myth? A folk tale?" "It is not a myth," she said, her voice trembling with a conviction that chilled me to the bone. "The first Reed to settle this land, Theron Reed, lost his wife and child in a storm, right in the cove below the cliffs. They say his grief was so immense, so powerful, it called something from the deep, something that fed on it. It didn't take his sorrow away, it took him. He was found on the shore days later, his body unmarked, but his eyes wide open, empty of everything, of life, of light, of soul. He was a husk." I stared at her, my rational mind grappling with the impossible folklore she was spinning. "That's a ghost story. Is it?" she challenged, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. "His son, the only survivor, saw what happened. He understood. The sea, our sea, doesn't just take the body. It can be called, and it will take the spirit too. But it only comes if it's invited. And the sound it hears above all others, the call it can never resist, is the sound of our weeping. The expression of our grief is the key that unlocks its cage. So we made a pact, a promise. We bury our dead in silence. We shed no tears. We offer it nothing. We give it no key. We keep our sorrow locked inside where it can't hear. The silent rite is not a tradition, Elias. It is a shield. It is the lock on the door of a prison. And my father is now interred. The lock must hold." She pulled away from me then, her face once again a placid, unreadable mask, and rejoined her family, leaving me standing in the alcove, the cold glass of the window at my back, and a colder fear spreading through my chest. I looked out at the gray, churning sea, the waves crashing against the cliffs. It no longer looked like just water. It looked like the wall of a cage, and I was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that I was now on the inside of it. The silence of the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of a held breath, a centuries-long vigil against a thing that waited, patiently, in the deep, cold water, listening for a single, solitary tear to fall. And I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the story of the silent burial rite was far from over. I had only just learned the first, terrible verse of a song I was now condemned to help sing. I had to know more. I had to understand the true nature of this pact, of the entity it was meant to contain, and what, if anything, could ever break it. My search for answers had just begun. The funeral was over, but the wake was eternal. In the days that followed Corvus Reed's silent burial, Saltwind Manor did not return to any semblance of normalcy. The extended family departed in their dark, expensive cars, their faces as impassive as they had been upon arrival, leaving behind the core household Maeve, Eleanor, a skeletal staff who moved with the quiet deference of shadows, and me. The silence they left in their wake was different. It was no longer the focused, ritualistic silence of the burial rite, but a thin, brittle quiet, stretched taut over a chasm of fear. We were all waiting to see if the lock had held, waiting to see if Eleanor's single, stolen tear had been enough to turn the key. Eleanor's explanation had reconfigured my reality. The world I had known, one of empirical evidence of cause and effect, of grief as a natural process, had been overlaid with a dark, superstitious map. Every gust of wind against the glass, every creak of the old house's bones, every sigh of the restless sea was now suspect. The sorrow eater, the grief taker. The name itself was a chilling piece of folklore, but Eleanor had spoken it with the dead certainty of gospel. I watched her, my fiancée, move through the cavernous rooms of her ancestral home. She was like a porcelain doll, exquisitely beautiful and perilously fragile. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a monotone, stripped of the vibrant inflections I loved. The laughter we had shared in the city felt like a memory from another man's life. She was performing the role of the dutiful Reed daughter, but the effort was costing her dearly. I could see it in the dark smudges beneath her eyes, in the way she would startle at the slightest sound, in the tremor in her hand as she lifted a teacup to her lips. Her mother, Maeve, was the warden of this self-imposed prison. She was a constant, unnerving presence, her iron, gray hair a fixed point in the shifting shadows of the manor. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, missed nothing. She watched Eleanor constantly, not with a mother's concern, but with the unblinking vigilance of a hawk watching a fledgling on a cliff's edge. Her gaze would often fall on me too, and in it, I read a clear, cold message: you are a liability. Your love is a weakness. Your modern sensibilities are a threat. She saw our affection not as a comfort for her daughter, but as a potential breach in the centuries-old defenses. Love, after all, is the twin of grief. To love deeply is to open oneself to the possibility of devastating sorrow. In the Reed family's calculus of survival, love was a risk they could ill afford. I knew I could not live like this, trapped in a silent, waking nightmare, watching the woman I loved slowly disintegrate. Eleanor's story was horrifying, but it was still just a story, a myth passed down through a paranoid lineage. My rational mind, though shaken, still craved proof. I needed to understand the foundation of this fear, to trace it back to its source. If this sorrow eater was real, I needed to know its rules, its limitations, its nature. If it wasn't, I needed to find the psychological key to unlock this family from its ancestral trauma. And the only place to begin that search was the one place in the house that felt like a vault of secrets: the library. On the third night after the funeral, I waited until the house had settled into its deepest quiet. A new storm was brewing offshore, the wind beginning to moan a low, mournful prelude around the eaves. Eleanor had retired early, feigning a headache, but I knew it was the crushing weight of unshaded grief that was pressing down on her. Maeve had locked herself in her late husband's study, a nightly ritual from which she emerged hours later, her face even more rigid and pale. I slipped out of my room, my stockinged feet making no sound on the thick runners that lined the long, dark hallways. The library at Saltwind Manor was a cathedral of forgotten knowledge, 2 stories high, with a wrought iron balcony running along the upper level. Its walls were lined floor to ceiling with thousands of books. The air smelled of decaying paper, leather, and beeswax. A large globe, like map of the stars, stood in one corner, and a massive oak desk, its surface scarred with the ghosts of ancient ink stains, dominated the center of the room. This was the heart of the Reed legacy, the repository of their history, and, I suspected, the source of their curse. I started my search methodically, running my fingers along the spines of books in the section marked Family History. There were official genealogies, leather-bound and gold-leafed, tracing the Reed line back for centuries. There were dry accounts of shipping ventures, land acquisitions, and business dealings. But there was nothing of the story Eleanor had told me. It was as if a censor had gone through the official record, purging it of any hint of the supernatural, of the true, dark reason for their strange rite. The silence was not just practiced, it was inscribed, codified, written into their history by its very absence. Frustration began to set in. I felt like a fool, chasing a ghost story in a dusty library while my fiancée suffered upstairs. I was about to give up when my eyes fell upon the large, intricate carving above the fireplace. It was the family crest, but rendered in greater detail than the simple versions on the headstones. A cluster of reeds, intricately carved, were bent low, their leaves intertwined with a powerful, coiling wave. But here, in the heart of the wave, almost hidden within its wooden curl, was a shape. It was vaguely humanoid but elongated, with a suggestion of a wide, open mouth like a silent scream. The Sorrow Eater. As I reached up to trace its outline, my fingers brushed against a section of the reeds that seemed subtly different. A knot in the wood that wasn't a knot. I pressed it. With a low groan of disused mechanics, a section of the bookshelf to the right of the fireplace swung inwards, revealing a dark, narrow cavity. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside was not a hidden passage, but a small iron-banded chest. It was not locked. With trembling hands I lifted the heavy lid. It was filled with a collection of smaller, personal-looking journals, bound in simple, worn leather, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. They were the secret history, the expurgated version. On the top of the pile was a small, slim volume. The ink on the cover was faded but still legible. The testimony of Silas Reed, begun in the year of our Lord 1688. Silas Reed, Theron Reed's son, the one who had survived, the one who had seen. I took the journal to the desk, positioning the small lamp to cast a pool of light on the fragile pages. The handwriting was a spidery, difficult script. I began brown with age, and the centuries fell away. October 12, 1688. My father's grief is a storm that outmatches the one that took my mother and my little sister Anya. He does not eat. He does not sleep. He walks the cliff path day and night, calling their names into the wind. The villagers say he is mad with sorrow, but I fear it is something more. There is a new cold in the air, a dampness that clings to the stone of the house, and it is not of the sea. It is a cold that comes from him, from the great, howling emptiness inside him. I am afraid. October 14, 1688. He wept today. I have never seen a man weep so. He stood upon the headland where we now stand for the rite, and his sobs were like the tearing of the world. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a soul being ripped from its moorings. As he wept, the sea grew strange. The waves, which had been crashing in a wild but natural rhythm, became still. A fog, thick and unnaturally swift, rolled in from the horizon, swallowing the light. It did not feel like water vapor. It felt like a presence. It smelled not of salt but of old, wet soil and deeper, colder things. October 15, 1688. The day the word ended, it came for him in the fog. I saw it from the window of my room, a shape coalescing in the mist down on the shore. It was not solid, more a distortion in the air, a patch of deeper darkness. But it had a form long and sinuous, and it moved towards my father, drawn to his weeping as a moth to a flame. He did not see it. He was on his knees, his face buried in his hands, his sorrow a beacon in the gray stillness. The shape enveloped him. There was no struggle, no sound. It was a dreadful, silent consumption. When the fog receded as swiftly as it had come, my father was still there on his knees. But he was changed. I ran to him. His eyes were open, staring at the sea. But they were hollow, like two polished stones. The man I knew, the soul of him, was gone. The thing from the sea had not taken his body. It had drunk his grief, and his spirit along with it. It had eaten him whole from the inside out. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. The room felt colder, the sound of the wind outside more menacing. This was not folklore. This was a first-hand account, written in the raw terror of a boy who had watched his father's soul be devoured. Silas went on to describe how he, in his terror, knew he could never show such sorrow, how he buried his father himself in silence, his own grief a burning coal locked tight in his chest. He described how he taught his own children the same terrible lesson. To feel was to be vulnerable. To weep was to issue an invitation. The silent burial rite was not a tradition, it was the desperate, fearful invention of a traumatized boy. I spent the rest of the night poring over the other journals. They told a grim story, a litany of near misses and constant vigilance. A Reed bride in 1742, new to the family, who broke down at her infant's funeral, and had to be physically restrained and carried from the cliffside before the fog could roll in. A cousin in the 1890s who, driven mad by depression, a word the journal's author used with clinical coldness, walked into the sea and was never found. Each generation added to the lore, refined the rules. No loud lamentations. No lingering at the graveside. All sorrow must be contained within the walls of the house, and even then, it must be suppressed, starved, until it withered. As dawn approached, a gray, watery light filtering through the library windows, I began to feel the true horror of the Reed legacy. They were not just protecting themselves from a monster. They were actively feeding a prison. Their own hearts were the cages, and their suppressed grief was the prisoner. For centuries, they had been systematically cutting away at their own humanity, cauterizing their emotions to keep the sorrow-eater at bay, and the cost was evident in the coldness of Maeve, the fragility of Eleanor, the oppressive, joyless atmosphere of the entire house. Over the next few days, armed with this terrible knowledge, I began to notice more. The house was not just silent, it was listening. I'd catch myself turning, certain someone had whispered my name, only to find an empty corridor. A bitter, inexplicable cold would pool in the corner of a room, raising the hairs on my arms, only to dissipate moments later. One evening, as I was passing a large, gilt-edged mirror in the hall, I saw a reflection that was not my own. For a split second, a pale, weeping face stared back at me from behind my shoulder, its features contorted in a mask of exquisite agony before vanishing. I spun around. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, fueled by lack of sleep and the grim stories I'd read. But the feeling of being watched, not by Maeve, but by the house itself, by the very air within it, grew stronger. Eleanor's single tear had been a drop of blood in shark-infested waters. It had alerted the predator. The sorrow-eater was testing the bars of its cage. I knew I needed another source, a human one. My mind kept returning to a figure I had seen at the funeral, a man even older than Maeve, stooped and frail, with wild, white hair and eyes that held a frantic, terrified energy. He had been hurried away by two stern-faced cousins immediately after the burial. I asked a housemaid who he was. "That would be Mr. Julian," she whispered, casting a nervous glance over her shoulder. "Mrs. Reed's elder brother. Hey, he keeps to his rooms in the old wing mostly. Not been right for years. Not right." In this family, that could mean anything. I had to speak to him. That evening, I made my way to the East Wing, a section of the manor that was clearly older and less maintained. The air here was colder still, thick with the dust of ages. I found Julian's room at the end of a long, draughty corridor. I knocked softly. A voice, thin and reedy, called from within. "Who is it? Has it come back? Tell it I have nothing left to give. Mr. Reed." "It's Elias Vance, Eleanor's fiancé." There was a long silence, then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened a crack and one bright, fearful eye peered out at me. The city boy. The outsider. "What do you want?" "I want to understand," I said simply. He seemed to consider this for a moment, his eye darting past me down the hall. Then he opened the door and pulled me inside, shutting and bolting it quickly behind me. The room was a chaotic mess of books, charts, and strange, esoteric drawings. Star charts lay next to title tables. Intricate diagrams of the manor's layout were pinned to the walls, covered in frantic-looking notes. Julian himself was a scarecrow of a man, draped in a threadbare dressing gown, his hands trembling. "You've been to the library," he stated, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. "You've read the books. You have the smell of old fear on you." "I have," I admitted. "I read Silas's testimony." A dry, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Silas, the first jailer. He thought silence was a shield. He was wrong. It's a bell. A dinner bell, rung very, very slowly. It tells the thing in the water, here we are. full of delicious, ripening sorrow. Just waiting for a crack in the door. What do you mean? He shuffled over to a large map of the coastline, his finger tracing the area around Saltwind Manor. It doesn't just feed on grief. It cultivates it. It nurtures it. This place, this land, it's a farm. Our family are the crop. The silence, the suppression, it doesn't make the sorrow go away. It makes it concentrate. It marinates it. It makes it richer, deeper. A quick, loud burst of grief is a snack. A lifetime of silent, repressed agony that is a feast. The thing is patient. It can wait generations for the perfect harvest. A wave of nausea rolled over me. The harvest. Julian's eyes glittered with a mad light. When the pressure becomes too much, when one of us breaks. It has happened before. Oh yes. They don't write about it in the main journals, but I know. I was there for the last one. My cousin Lyra. He sank into a chair, his body seeming to shrink. She was like your Eleanor, full of light. She fell in love with a sailor. He was lost at sea. She performed the rite for him, here, on the cliffs. She was silent. She was strong. But a week later, the grief became too much. She broke. She went to the cliff edge and she screamed. She wept. She gave it everything. A whole life's worth of love turned to a whole life's worth of sorrow. A vintage offering. What happened to her? I whispered, dreading the answer. The fog came, Julian said, his voice barely audible. Just like in Silas's book. It swallowed the headland. When it cleared, Lyra was gone. But that wasn't the harvest. The harvest was what came after. For a month, the house was wrong. The cold was everywhere. We heard her weeping in every room. We saw her face in every mirror. The thing in the water, gorged and powerful on her grief, was strong enough to push against the veil, to haunt us with the ghost of its last meal. It drove my father to his grave and left my mother a hollow shell. It broke me. It's been feeding on the smaller sorrows ever since. A little fear here, a little despair there. It's always hungry. He looked at me, his frantic eyes suddenly sharp and lucid. And now your Eleanor has given it a taste, a fresh tear, a promise of a feast to come. It's focusing on her now. It will whisper to her, tempt her, try to break her down, 'cause it knows what she holds inside. Not just grief for her father, but a great capacity for love. That's the real prize. Love soared into despair. It's the sweetest vintage of all. A crash of thunder from the burgeoning storm outside shook the very foundations of the manor. At the same moment, a scream echoed through the house. A raw, terrified scream. Eleanor. I didn't say goodbye to Julian. I wrenched the door open and sprinted through the dark, winding corridors, my heart a cold stone in my chest. The scream had come from our wing. I burst into our room. It was empty. The bed was turned down, but she wasn't there. The window, overlooking the cliffs, was wide open, the curtains whipping wildly in the wind, letting in the rain and the roar of the sea. My blood ran cold. I ran to the window and looked out into the stormy darkness. And I saw her. A small white figure in a nightdress, hair plastered to her head by the rain, standing perilously close to the edge of the cliff where her father's grave now lay. She was swaying, as if in a trance, her face turned towards the raging sea. But it was the sea itself that held me frozen in horror. In the flashes of lightning that illuminated the scene, the water below was not just a chaotic mess of waves. It was moving with a dreadful, intelligent purpose. The waves were not crashing against the cliff, they were reaching. Coiling like serpents, forming shapes that were almost hands, almost mouths, and rising from the churning chaos, a profound and absolute darkness was beginning to form. A patch of sea blacker than the storm tossed water around it, a void in the heart of the tempest. It was the shape from Silas's journal. The shape from the carving. It was gathering. It had been called. And I could feel it. Even from the house, I could feel its consciousness, a wave of pure, unadulterated despair washing over me, so potent it made me want to fall to my knees and weep for every loss I had ever known. It was a psychic cold that promised oblivion. It was the sorrow eater, risen from its slumber, drawn by the scent of a breaking heart. The lock hadn't just been rattled. It was shattering. The silent rite had failed, and the monster was coming to collect its due. The scream, followed by the sight of Eleanor on the cliff edge, acted like a key turning in my own heart, unlocking not grief, but a primal ice-cold terror. For a paralyzing second, I was just a spectator in a gothic nightmare, watching the woman I loved being lured towards a monster made of shadow and sea spray. The psychic pressure emanating from the churning darkness below was immense, a tangible force of pure desolation. It seeped through the window, carrying with it the phantom scent of wet graves and the crushing weight of every regret I'd ever had. It was an invasive, insidious power, designed to make you surrender, to make you believe that the only logical response to the pain of the world was the oblivion it offered. It wanted me to despair. It wanted me to fall to my knees and weep for Eleanor, for myself, for everything, and in doing so, add my own sorrow to its feast. Julian's words echoed in my mind, a frantic, desperate catechism. Love soared into despair. It's the sweetest vintage of all. The entity wasn't just attacking Eleanor. It was trying to break her heart so it could drink the contents. And my love for her, my fear for her, was the very thing it would use as a catalyst. I broke from my paralysis, my mind racing faster than it ever had. Running out there and grabbing her was the first instinct, the human instinct. But I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it would be a fatal mistake. To touch her in that state, to join her in that epicenter of despair, would be to ensnare myself in the same psychic web. The sorrow eater would have us both. The Reed's method was wrong. Silence was a slow poison. But their core premise was right. You could not fight this thing on its own terms. You could not fight despair with despair. I spun away from the window, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a weapon. Not a physical one. A different kind of weapon. What was the opposite of a silent, repressed grief? What was the antithesis of the sorrow, eater's soul, crushing despair? Not just happiness. Happiness was too simple, too fleeting. It had to be something with weight, with history. Something with roots. Memory. The Reeds had suppressed everything. Not just the grief, but the joy that preceded it. The love that gave the grief its meaning. They had tried to create a vacuum, and the vacuum had been filled by fear. Julian had said the entity cultivates its crop. It wanted the Reeds to be full of rich, potent, concentrated sorrow. But what if you offered it something else? Something indigestible? My gaze fell on a small, silver-framed photograph on Eleanor's bedside table. It was a picture of us from last summer, on a trip to the coast. A different coast, a warm and sunny one. We were laughing, squinting into the sun, my arm around her shoulder, her head tilted against mine. In that frame was everything Saltwind Manor was not: light, warmth, effortless joy, unthinking physical affection. Life. I snatched the photograph from the table. It was a pathetic shield against a thing of sea and shadow, but it was all I had. I sprinted from the room, down the grand staircase, my feet pounding on the dark wood. As I ran, the house itself seemed to turn against me. The psychic cold intensified, and the shadows in the long corridors seemed to wreathe and deepen. A whispering started in my ears, a chorus of despairing voices, echoes of generations of trapped Reed sorrow. She's gone, you've lost her. Let her go, weep for her. The entity was in the walls, in the air. It was fighting me, trying to trip me up with its suffocating aura. I burst out of the front door into the raging storm. The wind hit me like a physical blow, tearing the breath from my lungs, and the rain was a blinding, horizontal sheet of ice, cold needles. I clutched the small photograph in my hand, its glass already slick with rain, and ran towards the cliff path. The roar of the sea was deafening, a chaotic, thundering symphony of destruction. As I cleared the relative shelter of the manor's walls and started up the path to the headland, the full force of the entity's presence struck me. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a negative energy that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. The world seemed to lose its color, bleached to shades of gray and black by the strobing lightning. Below, the patch of absolute darkness in the water had grown, a vortex of liquid nothingness from which tendrils of shadow were reaching up towards the cliff, towards Eleanor. She stood just feet from the crumbling edge, her white nightdress a ghostly banner in the gale, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She was staring down into the void, mesmerized. The whispers in my head grew louder, coalescing into a single dominant voice, a distorted echo of her father, Corvus. Eleanor, it's so cold down here. Your sorrow will warm me. Your tears are all I need. No. I screamed into the wind, the word almost ripped from my lips. That's not him. I forced my legs to move, pushing against an invisible weight, a pressure of pure misery that made every step feel like wading through mud. I was 50 feet from her. 40. I could see her face now, pale and slack-jawed, her eyes vacant. She was lost. I had to break the spell. I had to fill the silence with something other than the storm and the entity's lies.
Yo!
I bellowed, my voice raw. Dio yorembiar paris. Tie cafontio rod de reviol yo your spielad coffee ale. Ovir se dras andi you alive you so hardy you snarted. The entity recoiled. Not physically, but I felt it. A flicker in the psychic pressure. A momentary confusion. It had been expecting screams of terror, sobs of grief. A shouted memory of laughter was an anomaly, a discordant note in its symphony of pain. Eleanor flinched. Her head tilted a tiny bird-like movement. I pressed on, stumbling closer, holding the photograph up like a ward. Lady, I'm a hero with your hookies, Yavarido, come apolo your half endure and why? May we plenty happy you call he I oxmo use that ikes jubawad urama umbar to octast oftat wa inel I masa wl. Beauty ron ital. A new image flooded my mind, projected by the entity. The face of Corvus Reed, but not as I had known him. This was a death mask, his eyes hollow sockets, his mouth a rictus of agony. She doesn't remember, the voice whispered. All she has is me. All she has is this pain. Alar! I roared, forcing the image from my mind. I was 20 feet away now. The wind was trying to tear me from the cliff.
Eleanor! T first time I tell you I love you.
INCHIT star RAN, ANDO PULO R sewed over OUR heads and Quesadiamo say demuenos mas called. Yawar hands war I know I har. Her body shuddered. A flicker of awareness entered her eyes. She looked from the churning void below towards the sound of my voice. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The entity fought back harder. The air shimmered, and for a heart-stopping moment, the space beside Eleanor was filled with the forms of her ancestors. Gaunt, weeping figures in archaic dress. Their faces masks of unending torment. They were the ghosts of the sorrow, eaters' meals. The stored despair of the Reed family, now wielded as a weapon. They all reach for her, their phantom hands beckoning. Join us, they seem to whisper. It is quiet here. It is peaceful. Your struggle is over. Just then another figure appeared on the cliff path behind me. It was Maeve. Her iron, gray hair was undone, whipping around her face like a fury's. She was holding a heavy, old-fashioned oil lamp, its light a small, defiant gold against the overwhelming dark. Her face was a mask of pure terror.
Elias, no!
She shrieked over the storm.
You fool! You are calling it to you! Your emotion is a feast!
Silence is the only shield. No, I yelled back at her, never taking my eyes off Eleanor.
Silencius tiachi!
Warino tutali jilers maybe.
Yours aggressive and ours.
Yowars he fiken kaiti far cheteris. I turned my full attention back to Eleanor, who was now trembling violently, caught between the phantoms of grief and the sound of my voice. I had to anchor her. I had to give her a memory stronger than all their pain combined. Cor wis reed, I shouted, the you a thunderclap.
No, T-E-H-T wild ebo sail. He-A-L-T-E rop up. He Calio is like T-P-L-E L.
Giek she aduff uti hes oduilas and he sped on your arm alakabiak
farjet IT lapi you. His lovi was to yoursi. It was a gift.
Like a T-I-S-T I just delayed.
Do E-T-M-S memo or I-N-E-O man now.
At the sound of her father's name, used in love and not in terror, something broke. A deep, guttural sob was torn from Eleanor's throat. It was a sound of immense pain, but also of immense release. It was the sound of a dam breaking. The phantom figures of her ancestors flickered and dissolved. The sorrow eater howled. I felt it as a wave of pure psychic rage. The darkness below swelled, a great, black wave rising up the cliff face, intent on consumption.
I teased a lot.
Maeve screamed, her voice thin with horror.
Sachi cried.
Itis come on G far. But I saw it differently. Eleanor's sob was not the whimper of surrender the entity had been waiting for. It was a roar of defiance. She had finally connected with her grief, but she had connected with it through a memory of love. She was not offering it despair. She was claiming her own heart back. She took a step back from the cliff edge, her eyes, now clear and streaming with tears, finding mine. "Elias," she whispered. The great wave of shadow was almost upon us. It was going to take us all. And then, the most extraordinary thing happened. Maeve Reed, the Iron Matriarch, the High Priestess of Silence, ran past me. She placed herself between Eleanor and the cliff edge, holding the small oil lamp aloft. Her face was transformed. The mask of cold control had shattered, and beneath it was a face of terrifying, magnificent fury. "You want a feast?" She screamed at the rising darkness, her voice cracking with a lifetime of unshed tears. "You want a harvest of Reed's sorrow? Then have it! Have it all!" She closed her eyes, and the floodgates of her own heart burst open. The psychic force that erupted from her was staggering. It was the grief of a lifetime, the sorrow for her husband, Corvus, the terror for her daughter, and something more, something older and deeper. I felt a flash of her memory, a vision of her as a young girl, watching a beloved older brother, Michael, walk into the sea, lost to a grief she had been forbidden to help him with. All of it, all the pain, all the loss, all the fear she had suppressed for over 60 years, came pouring out of her not as a weeping surrender, but as a righteous, defiant detonation of pure emotion. "Silent.
Whoa, bastard!"
she roared. The sorrow eater had been expecting the sweet, simple vintage of Eleanor's breaking heart. What it got was the cask strength, poisoned, explosive agony of Maeve Reed. The rising wave of shadow faltered. It was like a glutton being force-fed until it was sick. The psychic shriek of the entity was one of pain and confusion. It had been offered a meal so powerful, so laced with fury and defiance instead of simple despair, that it could not consume it. The wave of darkness convulsed, then collapsed back into the sea, which seemed to boil and churn in turmoil. Maeve crumpled to the ground, the lamp falling from her hand and extinguishing, leaving us in the stark flashes of the lightning. I ran forward and caught Eleanor as her legs gave way. We clung to each other, sobbing, drenched in rain and relief, our tears mixing with the storm. The psychic pressure was gone. The air was just air again, cold and wet. The sea was just a sea, wild and chaotic, but no longer intelligent, no longer hungry. We knelt by Maeve's side. She was alive, but utterly spent, as if she had poured out her very soul onto the cliff edge. She looked up at us, her eyes, for the first time since I'd met her, completely clear of their icy shield. They were just the eyes of a tired, grieving old woman. "The silence," she whispered, her voice a thread. "It was wrong. All this time, we were just fattening the beast." She reached out a trembling hand and touched Eleanor's tear-streaked cheek. "Cry, my love. Cry for your father. It is your right." And so we did. The three of us knelt on that windswept cliff, clinging to one another as the storm slowly broke around us, and we wept. We wept for Corvus. We wept for Maeve's lost brother. We wept for the generations of Reeds who had lived and died in fear, their hearts locked in cages of their own making. Our sobs were not the key to a monster's prison. They were the sound of our own freedom. Months passed. The autumn storms gave way to the thin, bright light of winter. Saltwind Manor still stood on its cliff, but it was a different place. The oppressive, pressurized silence was gone, replaced by a quiet that was natural and peaceful. The echoes in the walls had fallen silent. The cold spots had vanished. The house was just a house again. Maeve never fully recovered her physical strength, but her spirit, freed from its lifelong burden, was lighter than I had ever seen it. She would sit by the fire for hours, telling Eleanor stories of her father as a boy, of her own childhood, filling the house with the memories that had been forbidden for so long. She was teaching us that memory was not a weapon to be used against us, but a treasure. Julian, hearing of the night's events, emerged from his wing. He was still eccentric, still frail, but the frantic, hunted look was gone from his eyes. He and Maeve would speak for hours in the library, poring over the old journals, not with fear, but with academic curiosity, like two historians examining the dark ages of their own family. Eleanor and I stayed. To leave would have felt like a retreat, an admission that the entity still held some power over us. We were reclaiming our home, our legacy. We talked, we laughed, we argued, we filled the quiet spaces with the entity, beautiful noise of life. One crisp, clear winter morning we walked hand in hand to the cliffside cemetery. The sea was calm today, a vast sheet of sapphire blue stretching to the horizon. We stood before Corvus's grave, the simple granite slab bearing the mark of the bent reed and the curling wave. The symbol no longer looked like a mark of oppression, but one of survival. We bend, but we do not break. Eleanor knelt and placed a single, white rose on the earth. She spoke his name, not in a shout against a storm, but in a quiet voice full of love. She told him about her latest project, about a funny thing Maeve had said the day before. She cried a little, soft tears of missing and of love. I put my arm around her, and my own eyes were wet. This was the new rite. Not of silence, but of remembrance. Not of suppression, but of expression. We were not offering the sea a feast of despair. We were simply tending the garden of our own hearts, acknowledging that where there is great love, there will also be grief, and that it is not a thing to be hidden away in fear. They stopped crying for their dead because a traumatized boy taught them that their sorrow was a monster's dinner bell. The Silent Rite was born of fear, but we had learned a new, more powerful truth on that stormy night. The sorrow, eater fed on despair, on love that had been sored and left to fester in the dark. It could not stomach love that was fresh and honest and brave enough to exist alongside its own grief. We would cry for our dead now. We would cry for them because we had loved them. And that, we finally understood, was not an invitation. It was the ultimate shield. The silence of the Reed family was over. In its place was the sound of a name, spoken with love, carried on the clean, salt wind.